Let's talk about the technological filter. Now, I grew up in the 80s, and that was near the end of the analog era, the beginning of the digital era. Now, I understand, technically speaking, digital computers began in the 1940s, all right? Talk about the home computing era, though. This is when home computers began to become very commonplace, whether it be with like Apple IIs or Commodore 64 or IBM PC, the Mac, all these kind of home computers from back in the day. Maybe you had a Tandy color computer, whatever, right? All these things. And I grew up, I taught myself to read on a DEC Rainbow computer. My sisters and my dad used to play this game called Adventure, which was like a text adventure game called the Colossal Cave Adventure. And basically you play this character exploring a vast underground labyrinth of caverns. And you're looking for treasures and bringing them back to this well house where you drop them off in like a trophy case. And I asked them to read it to me. Like, I couldn't read. Now, I knew what the letters of the alphabet were, but I couldn't read. So I'm like, read me that. What's it say? I tested the fuck out of them. And they would read it to me, and I learned the phonetics of the English language. And so I learned how to read. Now, my comprehension wasn't very good. Like, there's one scene early in the game where you're following a river, and it tumbles along a rocky bed. And in my mind, a bed was something you sleep on. So I pictured the captain's bed that my parents had gotten me in the middle of a river, just made of rock. I'm like, that's kind of weird, but okay, there's a rocky bed in the river. So comprehension wasn't perfect. And so, I grew up with computers, playing computer games and video games, and eventually, got into dial-up bulletin boards. That's near the end of the time people had bulletin boards, early 90s, mid-90s. That's when it was dying out in favor of just, online services, AOL, Prodigy, whatever, dial-up internet, and eventually broadband. And I love computers, computer savvy, everything. I love being on the internet. I love doing research on the internet. I love being able to look up anything I want to look up. I love some amazing stuff. I can go on and on. Used to do online gaming, MMOs and combat games and whatever, but so I'm very acculturated to it. And I've observed that we used to have a very, analog infrastructure for the most part for information finding. Like, if you had a telephone, you got a phone book from the phone company. You got white pages in the front and the yellow pages in the back. You got an annual phone book. And if you want to look up a business or something, like, hey, check the yellow pages. If not, you had to ask around. Maybe you can call 411. That came later. You can call 411 and ask for, a business type, and they give you phone numbers. You had answering machines. You hook them up to your phone line. And some people had ones that had tapes, right? And others would have a digital memory. And of course, all phone calls were expensive unless they were local calls. And my local calling area is very small. For some reason, where I lived, I couldn't call anyone else I went to school with because there's a 4-school district. But I could call Manchester, New Hampshire, and that would be fine. I wasn't in Manchester, so at least I was able to call a lot of computer bulletin boards for nothing, right? Just my basic connection fee. But I observed that, we put this digital layer on top of analog reality, and then we slowly grew our dependence on it. And I remember in the early 2000s, there was arguments about whether or not to tax the internet, to tax emails, or it would not be feasible, but to try to tax emails or tax per megabyte of data or whatever. And I remember old John McCain arguing, no, we have to stop, not tax the internet. We need to let it grow. We need to let it prosper. And right then, my mind's like, they want it to prosper, so we become dependent on it. so they can then put the squeeze on us later. And that was a correct intuition, because that's where we are now. So not only are we dependent on the internet, right? We're not renting movies from the video store anymore, right? We're not renting even from Redbox anymore. We're streaming it online. And we don't even own, for the most part. You can still buy CDs if you want to. You can still buy DVDs if you want to. For the most part, people just content with streaming. So we went from a decentralized model where distribution was in many different hands, and you could own physical things, to things being purely through the choke point of the internet. And the analog infrastructure is beginning to be demolished. You have some places don't accept cash, and some places may not accept checks. And the U.S. government, my understanding, okay, after filing my income taxes, is that they do not actually write checks for refunds anymore. Now, I didn't know that until after I filed, and then I got to wondering, like, hey, I heard some rumor about this. So I looked online, like, apparently they don't send a check, but they will send you a form indicating that they need an account number to give a direct deposit. And it's interesting, they could allocate the resources to mail me a letter, but they can't mail me a check, but whatever. So we're dependent on this digital network now, and digital network controls everything. All inventories for businesses, and the just-in-time inventory. We even have routing for commercial vehicles that do service work. We have routing for the whole delivery network of trucks that exist. All this stuff, right? And so now we get to the point where the trap is beginning to close. And we have all this paranoia about, oh my gosh, people are looking at, erotic imagery on the internet, and there's an alleged threat of, there's keywords for YouTube I'm trying to avoid, T-ism, and we gotta, for the children or for national security, we have to begin implementing restrictions. So some states want to enact manufacturing restrictions on 3D printers, make it a criminal act to not have a 3D printer hooked up to the internet to check to see if the part you want to print out is it part of the allowed database of parts to be printed. Now, part of that is corporate fascism, that the manufacturers don't want people making their own parts for things that they sell. All right, they want to maintain a monopoly control over that. Just like with needing to pay a fee to repair your own tractors. Imagine that. John Deere, this American icon, is now an American icon of rent-seeking behavior, where you got to pay an annual fee to access and repair your own trucks. It's ridiculous. But the excuse, not the reason. The excuse is they don't want people making boomsticks with 3D printers. The reason is, of course, corporatism, but also just general control, squeezing you down and making you submit. And now that you're dependent on this digital technology, we can get even more control over you by just insisting that you do this and you do that and you jump through these hoops, and you'll deal with it. Just like whatever. I remember watching videos in Australia. They want to restrict paintball guns and gel blasters and things like that. Why? Because they can. That's why. Okay, and so that's an aside that's tangentially related, but I want to focus on the digital. Okay, so now we have this push to try to require all computer operating systems to indicate the date of birth of the operator before they can run the computer. And this is a big push towards the universal ID, digital ID, to access the internet, because right now we're so dependent on this thing, and we're also in financially very difficult straits because the dollar is tanking. And it's lost massive amounts of value since it was disconnected from gold, and our economy is going to tank. And all these different political movements, I've mentioned them before. The communism, fascism, Islamism, Christianism, whatever. Right? All these things. People are going to make their move, and the existing power structure does not want to be challenged. They want to identify troublesome people excuse me, or reflux, get old. They will identify troublesome people and keep control of them, and eventually control them by having one choke point for commerce, which is a central bank digital currency. Maybe they might call it by a different name here in America, a Fed coin or a dollar stable coins that are still programmable, surveillable money. And to basically, if you get out of line, they shut you off or they impose a penalty. And it's going to be less expensive than sending policemen with clubs and guns and whatnot, even though they're still probably going to do that, to maintain order. And so this chronic dependence on digital technology for everything, for communications and commerce and just everything else, right? I don't arrange to hang out with my friends by phone. We do it by Facebook chat. We're so accustomed to it, it's hard to imagine not using it. And so most people will give up just about anything to remain connected to it. Like, why would you want to go out and go shopping from store to store when you can just order from Amazon, right? So, this is a digital enclosure. And they're going after things like Internet Archive. So they could change history, so they could change official digital records. So it's harder to argue against the regime. So, okay, so this evil is the enclosure, and eventually it's basically to use a kind of social credit score to control people, right? And you want to keep your score up, or you get marginalized. So if you have a problem with being controlled that way, then the silver lining of this is now is your chance to learn to disconnect and to start doing things the analog way. Now, some of the old analog infrastructure is gone. You don't get a phone book delivered every year unless you order one. You can still order printed phone books. But like, if you want to arrange to do things and have events, like if you're an entertainer, what do? You advertise on Facebook. You say, hey, I'm doing a show here. Look at our schedule. Here's our show on this website. You don't have to do the hard work of passing out flyers or contacting promoters and whatever, right? So it's time to start switching back to analog. If you don't want to be part of the authoritarian, I would say totalitarian system the finishing touches are being put upon it, it's time to drop out. Start beginning to drop out. And it's difficult. It's difficult. I know. I printed some flyers from my handyman business, and I got these like trifold flyers, and I have to go downtown and like talk to people and hand them out. And I have to go to other towns nearby and pass them out. And like, that's difficult. I have to go back to the human connection way of promoting services. And eventually it's good to practice now while you can, get books. If you need to learn something, you learn it from a book. If you're autodidactic, you can teach yourself from a book, or you find yourself a mentor. And now, as much as I like to personally rip on, like radio clubs, right? So I used to have a ham license. I just let it lapse this year. And they talk about finding an Elmer at the local club, and the Elmer will teach you what you need to know. Basically, it's your mentor. It teaches you stuff about radio and how to do this and do that, and soldering and whatever, right? That human to human, what do you call it? Guru to student type of relationship. And we may have to start reconstructing these things to pass on information. And, maybe instead of, if you don't want to be on the internet, if you really don't want to have to put in your ID to access the internet, then okay, you can try to work around it. For a time being, you could do that, right? I don't know how much of a stranglehold the government is going to put on internet access. Like, they might find a way to force users of Facebook and YouTube and so on to identify and certify before you access them. But lesser known services and whatnot, peer-to-peer services might work out just fine through the existing infrastructure. I don't know. But I think that instead of trying to cling to the modern technological system, we have to be willing to regress somewhat. And so, networking then becomes more interpersonal, which is tough for me being a fucking autist. I admit that. Especially because most neurotypical people, when you talk, they really don't care what you're talking about. They just want you to make the right vibration. And then they go, yeah. And you get the vibe going and they feel good. And then finally you find a way to ask them a question. And then they'll answer it. You got to get them warmed up before you pop in the turkey, right? So, that's stuff I'm going to have to learn. And that helping each other out may not be a question necessarily of dollars and cents. It could be a question of just mutual exchange, barter, or even the gift economy, where I just give to you because you need something. And then when I need something, you give to me. And that can be done informally. That can't be surveilled by the state. And, no social credit score is going to stop you and they from helping each other. So, yeah, I don't like the idea that the government, that's supposed to be restrained by Constitution, which is not, obviously, wants to force people to identify and have the identifier follow all their online actions. And I don't like that they're going after 3D printers. But the silver lining is if we're willing to let these things go and go back to a more analog existence and working with our own hands and working with real materials like wood, like stone, like clay, and whatever, right? Then we can build an existence with some degree of sovereignty that's not dependent on this thing, while everyone else remains 100% dependent on it and gives up more and more and more. Now, like, I take care of a handicapped person, and I document this through an Android app. And that may require me to sign on, affirm my ID before using the Android app. And that might be the 1 foot I leave inside the system while I collect an income, while otherwise I just take out, whatever, cash for what I need to pay, and maybe have to start writing checks or buying money orders or whatever to pay my bills, and just be a little bit more disciplined, right? Instead of waiting until the day that my credit card's due to make a payment, then I just, as soon as I get the bill, I just go get a money order and send them a payment. But you take my meaning about the analog existence. It's time to rebuild, to the extent that we can, an analog existence. And who would you trade with? Well, probably other people who have a similar hang-up. Now, you may not even like each other, right? The fact that you're both rebels, you don't like the system, does not mean that you personally are going to like each other. You might have to work with people you can't stand, but you have the same fundamental moral conviction. And that might be all that's required, right? If your sense of right and wrong transcends any personality conflict, then you'll be able to slowly build analog networks of people who help each other. And maybe other people will be inspired. They might, right? And some of them may drop out and then and go analog too. Yeah, I wonder if we're gonna need to identify ourselves to operate a calculator. In which case, okay, Abacus is coming back, isn't it? The Abacus, or using a checkerboard as a calculator, which that's the thing. Look it up on Google. Maybe I'll put a link in the description of this video, checkerboard calculator. But yeah, maybe these analog calculators are going to come back too, and you'll have people running their businesses sliding checkers on a board to do their maths. Flipping beads on an abacus. I mean, Japan, they still use abacus. That's like a cultural custom. Why shouldn't we? All right, I have rambled now about this digital enclosure, this trap that's being closed on us now for over 20 minutes. I hope you get something of value out of it. I don't want you to feel anxiety, but if you do, there are constructive things you can do about it. And it's not going to be easy for any of us. It's going to suck. This beast system is going to devour and kill a lot of us, probably, but some of us will survive. And don't be afraid of death, okay? Well, the flesh fears death, all right? My body wants to keep breathing. If you push my head underwater, I will thrash about, right? And if you hang me by the neck, I'm going to thrash about trying to get off the rope, right? So, like, that's the flesh, though. What matters is how we live. We work on our spirit. We work on improving our souls through this flesh existence. And then when we pass, we move on to something more transcendent. So while the flesh fears death, the soul should not, because you're going to keep going. So it would behoove us to learn to live heroically and to be willing to defy evil. It does not mean you have to come at it. You just have to be willing to not go along with it. And of course, they may put you in a circumstance where, they come at you. Okay. And that's a different thing. That's a whole different discussion altogether. But in any case, that's all I got to say about this.